I remember the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer very well because I was at Buckingham Palace. I was working for the Queen, and the Queen said to me, "You can watch it on my telly. So take the corgis for a walk in the garden and then watch the telly and you'll know when we're coming back." So I was waiting for the bride to come back. She'd appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. And then, at the end of a very long red carpeted corridor, I noticed this ball of white racing towards me. And I realized it was Princess Diana. She'd rolled her train up into a ball, tucked it under her arm. She had her slippers in one hand, and she was racing down this corridor, lined with windows. And the diamonds of the Spencer family tiara were glinting in the sunshine. And she was racing towards me. Just me and her in one corridor. She was like a galleon in full sail. What a picture of hope and happiness and love. She had it all.
After they got married and they went on their honeymoon, I think even then things were starting to unravel a bit, because I don't think it matched what Diana had expected. She had this vision of being like a fairy princess and being carried away into the sunset. But the minute she was married, her husband was off working. I mean, it was, you know, he's always been a very hard worker and he was devoted to his duty.
I personally think that Diana fell in love with Prince Charles. It's obvious to me that she was a young, naive girl and she fell in love with the prince.
On the honeymoon, she was so in love, but he spent a lot of time reading books. You know, she was on this enormous yacht, surrounded by like 200 crew, and yet she was on her own and she didn't know how to deal with it. She was too young and too naive, and Charles was on the upper deck reading and sunbathing, and she was lonely.
Now, if you watch that piece of footage when Prince Charles is asked, "Are you in love, sir?" Princess Diana's beaming, and she's giggling, saying, "Yes, yes, yes." And he says, "Whatever love is." And she looks at him as if to say, "What are you talking about? Don't you know what love is?" That was the problem from the beginning. Charles didn't really know what love was.
Well, I used to say that Diana was a high school dropout and Charles was a university lecturer. I mean, Diana, they were so different, and obviously that can work very well, but she was very, very young and she'd had no experience of life.
I remember, the crowds were always crying out, "Diana, Diana, Diana." Instead of being proud of this and pleased about this, Prince Charles rather surprised me. He was resentful, he felt jealous.
In the early days, Diana's light was small, but he began to shine brighter and brighter and brighter. And it was a sort of a Star is Born situation. Prince Charles would say to her, "Well, I married you, I made you a princess. You weren't born royal. I'm the royal."
I remember it being in Vienna one day and they were crying out for Diana, and they were working on either sides of the street. And he said to the Viennese there, "She's on the other side of the street. You'll have to put up with me." And he wasn't making a joke. He was really rather upset about that.
When on royal visits, people would be shouting on one side of the street, "We want Diana, we want Diana." And I think in some interviews he actually did say, "I wish I could split my wife in half to do both sides of the street, because they don't actually want me."
So he felt surplus and didn't really know what to do with himself.
He resented the fact that his wife became a superstar, which I think any man would actually relish the fact that their wife was admired, because she may be admired by the world, but she married you.
This is a man who's been born to be king. This is a man who has been treated from the very beginning as a god. Suddenly being eclipsed by this woman, he wasn't very happy.
And then she started to find Charles very dull. And he found her stupid. I mean, she had a very quick wit, but she wasn't well read. She wasn't really educated, and Charles was highly educated and all his friends were much, much older. So he started to dump his friends. I think after Harry was born, the relationship seriously broke down. It just hadn't worked out like both of them expected, and even before the wedding, Diana had serious doubts, and so did Charles.
Prince Charles wasn't always kind to the princess. In fact, sometimes he was quite cruel. I remember one occasion she came downstairs wearing a beautiful black and white Catherine Walker gown. She said, "Charles, I've had it made specially. Do you like it? You look like you belong to the mafia," he said, which cut her down to her knees. Then on one occasion she came down in a tartan dress and said, "Do you like this one? Well, you look like a British Caledonian stewardess." It was always undermining, just before an engagement began, so that she would lose her confidence. So it was mental cruelty in a way. I never saw any physical violence. I saw tables being upset, I saw crockery being thrown across the room, but I never saw any physical violence.
She had to maintain a brave face for her children. She didn't want them too affected by her evident distress at finding herself in a loveless marriage with a husband who was carrying on an affair and not even bothering to hide it from her with Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles.
It was impossible to do this balancing act between the prince and the princess, the prince during the week and the princess at the weekend, and then have someone else pop in to this ménage à trois.
Well, Charles was in love with Camilla from a very early age. She's very, very attractive to both men and women because of her personality. She's got a wonderful personality.
It was incredibly difficult because the princess would ring me up from London and say, "Where's Prince Charles tonight, Paul? Where's the Prince of Wales?" "He's out for dinner, Your Royal Highness." "Where is he?" "I've no idea." "Of course you know where he is. You always know where he is." "Who's he got for dinner tomorrow night? I hear he's got a dinner party." "Who's coming?" "Don't ask me. Please ask him. Don't put me in the middle."
Camilla lived near Charles at Highgrove, and Charles used to see her on Sundays. And so when Diana drove back to London, to Kensington Palace, Charles would be out of the other end of the drive, driving off to Camilla's house, or she would be coming to Highgrove. And Diana knew perfectly well this was happening.
One day I told the princess that the prince was out. The prince found out. I'd been talking to the princess, thinking I'd been gossiping to her. He called me into his library. He rang his bell. I went into the library. Stood there. "Your Royal Highness, I hear you've had a conversation with my wife. Well, why are you talking about me being out last night?" "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness, but you were." "Well, can't you lie?"
It was a big party on probably on 3 or 4 floors, and she looked around, "Where's Charles? Where's Charles?" And then she realised that he must be downstairs on the lower level in the sort of basement area. And she went down there, and there they were. She obviously got this real anger, because you'd have to be very angry to do that, and brave. And she just confronted Camilla and said, "You know, I'm not stupid. I know what's going on." On the way back in the car, she was just in hysterical tears. And her protection officer, Ken Worf, was with her, and so he confirms all this, that she just sobbed all the way home, and I don't think Charles said a word. Then, in the December of '92, John Major stood up in Parliament and announced the separation.
Towards the end of her life, of course, she found her soulmate. Her soulmate was Hasnat Khan.
Well, Hasnat Khan was a heart doctor, and Diana loved doctors, and she was fascinated by the human body and how it worked, and she loved healing and saving lives.
Hasnat Khan had been the princess's companion for over 2 years. Nobody knew about Hasnat Khan. That was not played out on the world stage.
The press didn't really believe it. They thought he was overweight, He didn't look that attractive. You know, there was lots of pictures of him walking down the street eating Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he did fall in love with Diana, and it's actually tragic. It's tragic.
The princess had written me a letter, and in that letter she said, in her own handwriting, on her own stationery, her words were, "The next few months are the most difficult in my life. I fear that my husband is planning an accident in my car, head injuries, in order that he can remarry."
The Queen is head of the church, and the last thing she wants is a divorce. And so she must have thought about it very, very carefully and decided that that was the only way forward. I think they were both very sad. Diana in particular never wanted to get divorced. In her heart, although she was with another man, you know, Charles was the one that got away, and she always had a place in her heart for Charles.
You must remember that the princess lived within the British royal family for 15 years. She knew exactly what went on within it. She knew how things were done. She was at times extraordinarily unhappy, and her husband did nothing to make her less unhappy.
Towards the very end of her life, because I talked to her very shortly before she was killed, she said, you know, that she wanted her boys to know that she had loved Prince Charles, and in a way they still loved each other. She was getting on with him so much better. And she'd even stopped blaming Camilla. And I think that's important, because everybody thinks that when she died they were sort of fighting, but they were actually quite good friends again by then. Not good friends, but they were friends.
Is that bothering you? Is it?
That might be a bit much. That's all the bells of London tolling. Someone doesn't want you to tell a story.
No, perhaps Prince Charles has sent a message.
Yeah.